Okay, so I think we're going now. So I think I'm recording. So now I move back to this one. And if I do this, there we go. So I was going to say, where we are now is at the, if we just kind of remembering the first 2 weeks, we looked in the first week really of the kind of the idea of the fact that God is a communicating God. He's God, the Word, the message that he and the kind of the developments he promises a people via the personality of God, the Word, and then he instills in them the ability to write and to record history and the messages that he's going to give them. Then we moved on and we started to see the idea of the anointed ministries, which the culture was going to build around, culture that was now doable because we had the ability to write and record and to pass on in those sorts of ways. And now we're kind of coming into this period, as I said, that with the Exodus and with the establishment of the nation, we're starting to now see the worship of Yahweh being established as a world religion. The reason I'm kind of referring to it as the first world religion is because obviously the Jews get spread, well, not just they're Israelites to start with, but they get spread out right the way all over the place. So they're actually covering all over the world. So although they themselves are kind of staying culturally often distinct, there is something of the message and the. Go on, you're going to ask something, John?
Yeah, I am, because the division and dispersion fascinate me, because it's the way you get something to spread.
Yeah, exactly.
And so God, did he plan it?
I think probably, or to the degree that he knew it would happen.
Was it all sin, or was it all?
Or is it that he understands the way? It's a bit like if you know, as they often say that actually I think it's a bit in one of the Pirates of the Caribbean movies where Jack Sparrow kind of says that actually evil is really boring because it's really predictable. What you can't really trust is a good man, you see. Because actually evil always does what you kind of would, if you think it really is evil, it will always do exactly what you know it will do, if I can put it that way. So I think that right the way through Scripture you have a kind of the sense in which God understands and anticipates, and therefore uses and has worked that into the plan, which is a way of therefore maintaining human freedom, because it's allowed them to have their choice, but actually playing it towards an end which he's settled on. And I tend to, this is just now a quick theological comment, the way I tend to look at the issues of how kind of God fixes history is he is an active viewer like we are. So he's made us in his image, so he's made us to be able to view history. And there are places where he chooses not to look so that we have space to actually kind of unpack what happens in history kind of independently. But there are things that he's also looked at and he's kind of therefore fixed. So I see the cross as an event which kind of, if you like, I'm using the observe to preserve, or from quantum mechanics. If you look for a wave and you see a wave, it will be a wave back in history. It's one of these weird theories. Not theories. It's actually been measured. Your television wouldn't work without some of these things. So people may not like it, but they turn the television on and get the benefits. But in quantum mechanics, it's only when you kind of really fix what something is that it turns out its whole history now becomes that. But up until that point, if you look at it differently, its whole history would have been different. And so I see it a little bit like that there's a model in that of the way that history works. So God has marked out certain things that he's settled on. But then how we get there is up to us. But we can't, somehow history bends itself towards those points, if that makes sense. So and we say, oh, I'm not really free. Well, yes, you are. You're as free as, I'm not free to kind of snap my fingers and be in Dubai right now. It's just there's limits in my humanity as to how my freedom affects the world and how my freedom affects history. It does affect history. It's just there are certain bits that it doesn't affect, if I can put it that way, which therefore kind of draw us towards them. But anyway, that's now taking a slight aside from the we're looking at division, decline, defeat and dispersion. But it's not just here in Israel, because actually the early church, exactly the same thing happens. So Jesus actually, after telling the disciples to go and meet him in Galilee, where 500 people see him, he then says, now go back to Jerusalem. So they've just left Jerusalem, gone up to Galilee, seen the resurrected Jesus with a lot more, and then he says, now go back. They all go back. Church grows, 30-odd thousand people. and then the persecution comes, and they all get spread all over the Roman world. And the reality is that the Christian church just suddenly explodes into history. It's a kind of a mystery in one sense, as to why it suddenly, to the secular mindset, that within a century, from nowhere, from zero, it's suddenly there and really well established. And embarrassing to all the theories about how the Bible's developed, because oh no, this is my stupid computer. Sorry. This it will now have.
You shouldn't tread on it, Kristen.
Okay, right. Let's keep going. Let's. And what's happening now?
It's having a coffee break. Some background history.
What's happening now?
It's having really fun.
Yeah. Right. So let's just stop this for a second. So let's get it going again.
Got the rock face back.
Got the rock face back. Let's do.
Okay.
There we go. Okay. Yeah. So I was saying this last week. At some point, we're going to definitely, I think, kind of do a. So I'm going to do some sort of project to get something good to do these on. But anyway, at least what it didn't do this time was totally turn off, which it started to do a little bit. So I better get going, hadn't I? Yeah. So we actually kind of get our way through. But I need to see what's happening with the recording as well. So I just need to move my. Sorry, I'm.
A little bit of editing coming in now.
Yeah, we can. I know. I can edit out as long as we're still capturing it, and that's what I actually want. What I'm doing now, so that I can just check that we're still recording. Having failed on the last few, it'd be a real shame to miss this one, seeing as it tells me it's still recording, so that's good. Okay, so let's pretend we're just making a clean start at this point. That's it. Let's get going. Okay. So we were talking. So the diaspora, the spreading of the people, kind of takes them all over the world, very similar to the early church, and so on. So touched on this before. The Old Testament, as we know it, it's coming together 800 to 400. We're at a period here in that 800 period. So this is the period when the Old Testament is now coming together. So the Exodus it happens in the 15th century BC. So we have had up to this point kind of 700 years where people have been writing stuff down, but they were tending to write on clay tablets, because that's what the style is at this point still. Carving into the soft clay, leaving them out to bake, sometimes taking impressions of one tablet onto another. If you've got something really concrete to say, you carve it onto the rock. And so these things, and the stories that, as we have them in Scripture, are kind of captured in those moments up to this point. And so it's around 800. And it's interesting to see how it all kind of kicks off. So it's roughly 200 years after Solomon. So Solomon has built the temple. And the temple, and the idea of it, of course, it was a united kingdom at this point, is it's supposed to become the repository, and this is where the scribes and the Levites, and they have offices there and so on. And so it started that kind of process, but then, of course, the first thing that's happened is the nation has divided, and so the northern tribes go off and start to maintain their own set of records, and their own sets of stories and so on. And it's during the reign of Jeroboam II, which I always assume that because there's two of them is probably why we call champagne a Jeroboam when there's two of them. There's a yes, there's less of a joke. It's one of these things I think about. I wonder if that's why it is, because there are two Jeroboams, you know. There's two in a Jeroboam. He actually, in a political terms, he is a really good king. In that the GDP of the country does him fantastically well, but the people do very badly, which strangely is what we've now made the gold standard of the way we measure economics, isn't it, in the world? If GDP is going up, who cares if everybody's miserable? Is kind of, being really blunt, how it sort of works. And then we argue that, well, because it's going up, everybody must be happy. But that's what's happening. Is he in one sense is very successful, and so he reigns 786. So he's up in the north, down in the south. He covers several Amaziah, Uzziah, down in Judah. He rules 41 years altogether, and it's during his reign that significant things start to happen that kind of start to draw the Bible together as we have it. I've got this kind of genealogy, but it's a little bit hard to kind of see. You can see up the top there Saul, and then David, and then Solomon, then Rehoboam. And it's at the time of Rehoboam that the first Jeroboam, if you see on the other side, splits off and the northern tribes go their own way. So now we have kind of two lines. So the green line kind of follows all the way down, which is Judah, and the northern tribes, the red line. But the thing that is kind of really interesting is that under him, Israel, as I say, it becomes extremely prosperous. It actually goes to 350,000 inhabitants. It's worth noting the figure, not for any other reason, but remember when we were looking at the Exodus, and I said the 3 million figure that we kind of work from the 600,000 foot soldiers. The problem with the number is it's just so off the scale in terms of the population of the world at the period. So this is notable because it's up until kind of about the time of Jesus. It's kind of and the time of the big empires. This is about as populated as the land of Israel has ever been. So it's 350,000. Just because we don't have modern farming techniques, you can't sustain populations of millions and millions. But we've got evidence that puts it around that kind of amount in terms of graves and tombs and so on. And during this kind of phase where they're growing as a nation, this is Israel rather than Judah, they actually extend their borders. And actually we have a prophecy about that from Jonah, not in the book of Jonah, but in the book of Chronicles. It's in Chronicles. Jonah prophesies that they were going to extend their boundaries, and they do. But at the same time, all that's going on, there's this kind of growing immorality, there's social injustice, pagan worship starts to flourish, and it puts the king and the wealthy at odds with the prophets. So, if you like, the social kind of context, whereas the nation is getting wealthier, but it's often done so in terms of favours from a king who's therefore taking land from people, and people are losing their inheritance. And of course, you remember, eventually the tribes of Judah will go into exile for not keeping the Jubilees. Well, that's already happening. It's not just that the Jubilees are being kept, but as actually God had prophesied, when you want a king, they'll end up redistributing the land, and you'll all use your plot. So suddenly people are being disinherited from what, in one sense, has always been their spiritual inheritance. And so not surprisingly, it starts to stir people up to start prophesying. And interestingly, probably the earliest prophet, I don't think I've got him there, is probably Amos. Some will go for what's his name, Obadiah, who I've not put on there, but I put Obadiah later at Jeremiah. The only reason is Obadiah doesn't give us any clues in terms of timing. He just prophesies, but his language is very similar to Jeremiah's, and I think that makes the best context for him. But Amos is probably the first, and what's interesting is Amos is actually from Judah. So Amos is stirred enough to leave his sheep, because he's a shepherd from Tekoa, which is down in the south. He leaves his sheep, goes all the way up to the northern festivals, and prophesies again. So you can see this isn't just a kind of a whim. It's that people are genuinely being stirred up spiritually with what they see going on. And then very significantly, in 763 BC, there's an eclipse, and it's followed a couple of years later by a massive earthquake, which has been estimated, because you can see the marks of it in archaeology, as around, I said estimated 8.2. If you look, you'll find slight different estimates. I've gone for the middle range, from somewhere between 8 to 8.5. So I've kind of put in there the 8.2. Interestingly, here we go. According to the Bionic Man, because this is a guy called Steve Austin, is this statement here. No, nobody else remember watching it then. We can rebuild him, Steve Austin here. This says, this magnitude 8 event of around 750 BC appears to be the largest yet documented on the Dead Sea transform fault zone during the last 4 millennia. And that little phrase, the Dead Sea transform fault zone, that's the kind of actually where we can tell, where the earthquakes kind of come from, and it's actually in as I touched on this before, the Dead Sea, where you can kind of take soil samples down, you can see the evidence of earthquakes and so on. And it's quite accurate, but you can't pinpoint to a year, because an earthquake shakes the layers up, and so then you can't tell whether there's 3 layers or 10 layers, so you have to kind of make an educated guess a few times, which is why it's got approximately 750. And actually, you find that event, the eclipse and then the earthquake, appears right the way through the Bible, and there are multiple direct biblical references to it. So Amos refers to it. So it triggers him. It kind of almost stirs Amos to go and prophesy. It's like, we've just had these events. There's been an eclipse and there's been an earthquake. I need to go and prophesy. And then it's in Zechariah, and possible indirect references in Isaiah and Joel, and then actually even in Hebrews, there's a kind of reference, to everything being shaken. So if you think about that in terms of just the picture of the Bible as we have it, as we've understood it and we've seen it, that God the Word has inspired them to start writing, and they've been collecting bits, and it's in various different places, and it's now spread out. But the eclipse and then the earthquake really kind of trigger a bunch of events that draw everything together. It becomes almost like the catalyst. And so in a strange sort of a way, it's a kind of one of these things that I only spotted this last week when I was preparing the material. So I thought, I've always known about the eclipse and the earthquake. It was only when I kind of thought, I had this little diagram, and I was just thinking, of course, the earthquake happens just before all this starts. So you can kind of see it graphically. So I put those little icons in. Thought it literally is, isn't it? If you stop, we've had Elisha and Elijah before, but Elisha and Elijah haven't written their own stories, and they've come to us as narrated stories that someone later has written down, and you can tell that from the style in which they're written. If you see the difference compared with these prophets who are writing down their own oracles and delivering them as oracles complete. So this is the oracle of Amos, and here it is, and probably he's the guy who someone writes it down for him as he's speaking.
Have you got in your own mind an explanation why that was the trigger?
So I think that what it is obviously it's a very physical event.
Yeah.
Genesis says the sun and the moon and the stars for signs and seasons, but they don't practice astrology. But what they do look is major events. If you sort of think of it like that.
Yeah.
So the eclipse is a major event, and so that instantly kind of it stirs up those who are seeking the Lord, praying regularly. It starts thinking, what's going on, and they're looking up to the north where it's all going. Actually, at one level, it looks like it's going very well, but actually the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. And so in particular with perhaps with Amos, as I say, as the first, it stirs him enough to leave his sheep down in the south and go all the way up and suddenly stand up at the feasts which are happening up in the northern tribes, which of course aren't happening in Jerusalem. They've resurrected the old shrines of Shechem and Shiloh and some of the places that we read about in the earlier books. They've become their cult centers that people come to. And the very places that the judges used to sit in judgment, if you go back to the books of Judges, they're the same places. So they've kind of made those their spiritual pilgrimages places. And he turns up there. They've now turned Yahweh into a pair of bulls. So we have, they've started to become a little bit more pagan because as they trade more with the nations around them, they're adopting the kind of the form of religion that's going on there. And so that's why he turns up and starts prophesying and kicks off, if you like, this run of really key voices that actually, if you go and look online today, tomorrow it will be different, but actually people are still analysing and talking about these prophecies. We know it because we're Christians, but what I mean is, it's not even that as Christians we know what they mean. They are being reinterpreted constantly. And if you think about it, that whole flow of events is kind of really kicked off with a geological and an astrological signs in the heavens, signs on the earth. If you think of it like that. So Amos and the guys kind of get going. I've highlighted there the major prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, and Ezekiel. So here's Amos talking about, so in the day that I visit the sins of Israel. So he's talking about the north, talking about their sins. I will visit the altars of Bethel. So this is a place where they're supposed to be worshipping the Lord. And the horns of the altar I will will be cut off and fall to the ground. And that's, there's a kind of a question mark there as to whether there have been places that when the earthquake has come, where some of these altars may have actually have fallen. It may have prompted and given them the courage to kind of say, it really will happen here. For behold, Yahweh commands, and the great house will be smashed to pieces, and the little house into bits. And I like that little phrase because, I like that little phrase. The great house, he may not have meant it this way, but sometimes you can see with the Holy Spirit in it, Israel is the bigger of the two nations, because actually, strangely, it's going to happen to Judah as well, just centuries later. It's going to be a bit of time before it happens yet. It's going to start with the big house, with Israel. Won't the land tremble for this? You see, so again, he's referencing the earthquake, and all mourn who dwell in it. I saw the Lord standing beside the altar, and he said, strike the tops of the pillars, that the thresholds may shake, and break them in pieces on the heads of them all. And as I say, it's kind of likely that he's taken an experience that they've already seen in part and saying this is now the thing that's fully happening. If you want to try and make it before, it just means that it doesn't quite fit timing wise. So in other words, if it's 100% prophetic, that the earthquake hasn't happened, it doesn't quite fit in terms of the timings of where it seems to fit. It seems more that he's taken the earthquake and used the imagery of it to say this is what's really going to, it's a sign of what's coming, if I can put it that way. So yes, you shall flee, like this is now Zechariah, who's of course writing a fair bit later. You shall flee, just like you fled before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. So this is the same reference. Remember saying Uzziah in the south and Jeroboam in the north. See that you don't refuse him who speaks, for if they didn't escape when they refused him who warned on the earth, how much more will we not escape, who turn away from him who warns from heaven, whose voice shook the earth then, but now he has promised, saying, yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. That's from Hebrews, of course. Who's again, he's kind of quoting back, drawing from this. So it's just kind of interesting. I'm not at my clearest at the moment, but how, because I when I saw it, I thought, I've just totally missed this for years and years and years. That Scripture itself is referring back to this kind of event, which actually sits there at the birth, if you like, of the prophetic movement. If you put it like that, it's not that they haven't had prophets before and the people can, but actually to kind of record the kind of style of messages and the type of message that they have, all kind of comes back to this very physical, real event. And so right the way through into the New Testament is being referred back to. Zechariah, of course, is hundreds of years later, or nearly 400 years later, 300 and something years after Amos. So centuries later, Zechariah is still referring back to it.
Must have been a huge event.
Oh yeah, well, if you think of 8.5, if it goes up to 8.5, it's a massive one. And as I said, according to that guy who's researched it, the biggest one in 4 centuries, 4 millennia of looking at the evidence. We can't find a bigger one in the region. So that enormous earthquake happening a few years after there's been an eclipse, kind of kicks something off. So we come to as I say, here we are. This is the kind of the period then. So that's my kind of setting the scene. So Jonah during that period, as I mentioned, he's already prophesied about prosperity. It's 2 kings. I said Chronicles, it's 2 kings. He's talking about Israel's borders being stretched north and west, but they're now in regular conflict. As they have kind of grown out, they've started to hit what's going to become the problem. How God is going to, in one sense, the judgment that Amos is going to be predicting is going to be delivered, which is the Assyrians, who they're starting to push into and knock into up in the north. So Jonah, who's from Galilee, gets a call, and he actually then goes to Nineveh, which he's not very happy with, of course, at the time, and he goes and preaches repentance there. And it's worth noting how early this is, because actually the book of Jonah is really popular with missionaries, because as they would say, it highlights God's kind of priority for the missionary dimension of Israel. So Israel and Judah, of course, the original commission to Abraham is you're going to be a blessing to all nations, and they're supposed to be kind of outward looking and so on. But suddenly they're beginning to, and they've come out from Egypt, and God has made them multinational, not genetic. So in other words, you can become Jewish just by conversion. You don't have to have been born Jewish. That was unique and different. So they've already been a place that people can collect to. And of course with Jonah, we've got someone here who's right with, if you like, the expansion program. As a prophet, he's with the expansion program. He's prophesying positively about it, and then God says, "And now I want you to go and tell the Assyrians that they can all get saved too." If you think of it in rather crude terms, that's the message, which is why he doesn't like it. And it's not going to go down well in court, which is probably why he wants to get away. Because if anybody knew this is what he was going to do, they wouldn't like it at all, because Assyria is becoming a problem. But something in him knows that kind of God has this plan for the whole of the world and the nations as well. So it's a key development. It's a Gentile mission. It's the first time. Jonah is the only Old Testament prophet that Jesus likens himself to, because we're going to go through a similar kind of seismic event, shift of the focus at that point. So 732 BC, Assyria breaks the latest kind of Israeli rebellion. They've kind of they've started to push down. They've told they've taken some control, although they have some independence in Israel. And they actually then take territory from Galilee to Gilead, and they move people in. So Galilee becomes Galilee of the Gentiles. There are still Israelis living there, but they've now got next door neighbours from all over the Assyrian Empire. So 732, 725, many Israelites get deported from the annexed territory. And actually other nationalities are moved in alongside now. So Zebulun, oh there you go, that's really what I was just saying, yeah. They take people from those regions having taken the territory, and it becomes Galilee of the Gentiles. So Israel is now reduced to the territory we think of as Samaria. It's kind of that slightly lower rump. So in the north it's a bit mixed. Israel is now reduced to that sort of kind of middle ground, and Judea is still getting away with it because they're a bit further away from where Assyria is. So 725, there's still more trouble from the reduced size Israel. So the Assyrians under Shalmaneser V, and they besiege Israel's capital city of Samaria, and eventually they break it by 722. So you see, we're getting into real history now. You can verify all this. It's biblical history, but you can verify it from the Assyrian records, which are very good records. The Assyrian records, because they used astronomical signs and events to record dates. Which means you can fix them much more concretely than you can, for instance, dates in Egypt, because dates in Egypt are all just done. The best they do is the cycles of new moons, but the trouble is the cycle of new moons repeats itself every 32 years. So I think it might be 39 or something like that. But it's every kind of within less than a generation, the cycle is repeating itself. But the Assyrians were very good at that, which is great because it helps us kind of put the picture together. So by the end of the 8th century BC, what you're now seeing, because they've now broken, is that there's a hybrid culture and people that are developing in Samaria. So technically, they're still worshipping Yahweh. So we still refer to it as Yahwism. So that Yahwism provides the kind of the religious framework, but it's now got mixed with pagan culture and patterns and idols, and those are the people that become the Samaritans of the New Testament. And although there's now literally just hundreds still living in the region, they still exist today. So the Samaritans would have their own religion, which is Yahwism still. They use the Samaritan Pentateuch, which actually, in a strange, ironic kind of way, the Hebrew version of the Samaritan Pentateuch is older than the earliest complete Jewish version we have. So it goes back to about the 4th century BC. But it's quite a corrupted text because they've added ideas to it from other places, but it's kind of a useful comparative text. So these people become the become the Samaritans, because that means in Judah it's getting a bit worrying, because gradually the Assyrians are kind of pushing down. So King Ahaz at that point goes to seek guidance from a royal prophet. So Isaiah, who is actually a young prince. So we know that from the Jewish records that actually he's part of the royal household, but he is recognized with a prophetic gift. And so Ahaz goes to visit him as a relative, effectively as a relative with a prophetic gift, and asks what's going to happen. And that's the beginning of the book of Isaiah. So we kind of pick it up and we hear his whole story. And Isaiah now so we've had a number of these prophets like Amos and Obadiah and so on, and Jonah. But Isaiah is going to really set the precedent in that the visions he has are going to kind of have a huge, big, long sweep. In fact, they do. Isaiah's prophecies still look towards the second coming, so there's still bits that we're unpacking and unraveling. And he kind of prophesies in 3 waves. So he prophesies that to start with, because he's gone to be asked what's going to happen with the Assyrians. And he starts responding by talking about it's not going to be that long. By the time a young girl's got pregnant and had a child and the child's weaned, it won't be an issue anymore. And the kings you're worrying about, actually the kings that are being worried about by Ahaz aren't the Assyrians. They're actually, because the threat from the north, the Moabites and the Edomites are kind of hastening from the south. So Judah's getting squeezed on both sides. And so he starts off by prophesying, about this child, but in terms of just a short time scale. And then he goes on prophesying about it, and the child suddenly grows, and so suddenly the child is eternal God, mighty counselor, Prince of Peace, and so on. And so the child kind of, although it starts very simply, it's just about a time scale. A young girl shall conceive and have a child, and that happens very naturally. It's not the big miracle, but he prophesies in a way that meant when the rabbis looked back at it, they could see that it hadn't yet been fulfilled, because he prophesies it in this kind of continuous sense, as if it's something kind of that God's continuously going to be doing. And so in the first wave of kind of prophecies, he establishes that there's going to be someone coming who's born of a virgin. This person's going to minister in Galilee of the Gentiles. They're going to represent God is with us. They're going to be called Eternal God, Prince of Peace, Wonderful Counselor, and so on. And then there's a kind of a gap, really. And during this time, the Assyrians are kind of harrying the Israelites in the north. There is a kind of there's a moment, a little kind of historical kind of turning point where the Babylonians, who are kind of growing power in the north next to the Assyrians, so the Assyrians are kind of here and then the Babylonians are next to them. Babylonians are growing in size, and they send a delegation down to Jerusalem, and so I just remember who it is who takes them to go and see. I think it may be Ahaz takes them to go and see the temple. And that causes Isaiah to say that was a mistake, because they're going to be back in a number of years and they're going to be after the treasures of the temple, and it will mean the end of the temple. And that little turning point, then after that, he then starts to prophesy to that context of when this is going to happen. So Isaiah starts to prophesy of when it is. So Judah is not going to fail at the same time as Israel. Israel is beginning to fail. It's already happening up there. It's not going to happen just yet in Judah, but it is going to happen. But it won't be the Assyrians, it will be the Babylonians. And in that context, he prophesies the character of the suffering servant. But again, he prophesies in a way, just like he did with the child, where the character starts to take on a much bigger thing than just as an example. So he starts to prophesy them as an example of someone going through the persecution on Judah. So the suffering servant is going to suffer on behalf of the people. It wasn't really his fault. It's events that are bigger than him, but he's going to suffer as a result of it, and by his wounding we're healed, etc., etc. And so the character starts in the way that Isaiah prophesies over them, becomes a bigger and bigger character, just as the child did. So he's also going to be a light to the Gentiles. He's going to suffer an undeserved punishment. He's going to carry the consequences of the sins of the people. And so he's really prophesying 70 years ahead of himself, because it's going to be 70 years from when he prophesies to when the things happen. And in Jewish thinking today, Isaiah was prophesying Jeremiah. So that's how they see it, because Jeremiah went through this turmoil, and they then kind of shut it all up now. They don't want to see it. Well, I say they don't want to, but there is a strong movement that existed even in Jesus' day that saw the suffering servant as a type of Messiah. So, yeah, if you meet a lot of Orthodox Jews today, will just say, well, no, it happened to Jeremiah, forget it, stop trying to apply it to Jesus. That's the way it's kind of understood. But actually, it's not totally true, because the rabbis did actually think that he was a bigger character than just the historic character. And that again follows that very Jewish way of understanding prophecy. It's kind of a cycling, a bit like you plant a seed, and the next year you've got a little shoot, and then it withers down, and the next year you've got a bigger thing, and then eventually you've got the whole tree, but it kind of goes in bursts, so it kind of grows in those ways. And as time goes on, though, towards the end of his life, Isaiah starts to see that he's prophesied the destruction of Judea, but he gets prompted to now prophesy the return and, if you like, the restoration of everything, and gives us a wave of prophecies which we tend to apply now to the second coming and looking for the ends of the age. But actually, of course, in the historical context, from a Jewish point of view, they say, well, it was the return of Nehemiah and Ezra and the rebuilding of the Second Temple, which he was focusing on. So you can see how Isaiah gives us this framework, which has a kind of an instant working out in Jewish history, which would be remarkable in its own right, if you think about it. You know, here he is prophesying in around 600 and something. It's in the 600s that Isaiah is prophesying things that are going to be happening, and he prophesies stuff that go for the next 2 centuries, really. He's covering history there. But he prophesies in a way that his characters take on a much bigger dimensions and much bigger life and start to become part of the framework for the understanding of what God's doing right the way through history, which is the way we now see them as we look back and we see Jesus in them and so on. So in that third wave, we have famous lines like, you know, he who preaches good news, setting captives free. Jesus quotes them at the beginning of his ministry. And these verses are now fulfilled in your hearing. He puts the Holy Spirit into the midst of the people and so on. And so those are all part of that third wave of Isaiah's prophecies. So I'm kind of croaking away here. He also prophesies that Judah and Jerusalem will eventually fall to the Babylonians, but they will return and they will rebuild because of a king called Cyrus. And, you know, there's all sorts of controversy because he names the king. So people say, well, it must have been written after the king, because how would he possibly know the king? Kind of missing the whole point here. That, you know, that is prophecy. That is the nature of it. So anyway, during the 7th century itself, kind of this clever political manoeuvring allows Judah to kind of grow a bit, shrink a bit, but they stay self-governing under Hezekiah, Manasseh and Josiah. But Syria now is coming under pressure from Babylon in the north, and now Egypt is pushing up from the south as well, which is kind of squeezing Israel in the middle, but Jerusalem is a bit to the side, so it's kind of managing to get away with it for the time being, as they push them up and down. So 609, so we're getting now near the end of the 7th century. Assyria finally falls to Nebuchadnezzar in the north, and Pharaoh's name is Necho, snatches the southern territories that are under Assyria, which include Palestine as we think of it today. Pharaoh Necho deposes Jehoahaz, who'd succeeded Josiah as king in Jerusalem, and he replaces with his brother, who's called Eliakim, who becomes Jehoiakim. So he gets he takes over the line of kingship. 606 BC, Nebuchadnezzar defeats Necho in Syria. So he besieges now. He comes down, besieges Jerusalem, and Jeremiah is there, and he's caught up in that siege. And Jeremiah now prophesies ahead as well. And in this kind of context where the siege is going on, he prophesies that there's going to be a 70-year deportation to Babylon, which of course doesn't go down well when you're holding out, you know. You're hardly playing with the home team. I mean, I often think the trouble is, you know, we take a very kind of superficial sort of view of who's good and who's bad in Scripture, you know. But I think if I'd been there in Jerusalem, holding out courageously against the invading forces, and there's some bloke standing outside the temple saying, "You're all doomed," I would be tempted to think, "Oh, would someone shut that bloke up?" So, you know, it's just the way it goes, isn't it? Unfortunately, is the truth of these things. So 605, there's a first deportation. So the city is broken, but it's not really taken. But what happens is, as is in the way of empires, is they take the children of the leading kind of families, and so Daniel is taken as a child, and he is deported. So it's now kind of, so if you rebel, remember we've got your kids. Which happens right the way through European history. It's the way it happened. It is the way of the world, you know. I'll take you as my ward. You come and live in our house, and we'll all be friendly with you. But actually, you're here, so we'll stab you if your parents ever rebel. It's kind of the way it goes. And so Judah at this point has become a vassal state of Babylon. Jehoiakim is king, but it's only because he's been put in place. It was originally by Pharaoh Necho, but the Nebuchadnezzar allows him to stay there. Necho pushes back though, and Jehoiakim ignores Jeremiah's advice and tries to join his rebellion. So Jeremiah said, don't trust in Pharaoh. If you remember reading these verses in Jeremiah, don't trust Pharaoh. You think he'll be your friend, it's not going to work out for you. But Jehoiakim obviously feels he owes Pharaoh something because he was the one that made him king. But as a result, Jerusalem gets besieged a second time, and now Jehoiakim gets captured but dies. And so Jehoiakim becomes king while they're still under siege. The siege then is successful, so 597, and as a result there's a second wave of deportations, and this one actually includes Ezekiel. So now up into Babylon we've now had the child Daniel, and we have the young adult Ezekiel. So although Daniel has gone first, he's not going to start prophesying yet because he's still some years younger than Ezekiel. Zedekiah, so 592, sorry, we can be quite precise on these things now. 592, Ezekiel is there in Babylon, weeping over what's happened. And he has a famous vision about the wheels within wheels. But the thing that's really key in the thing that we often miss, which kind of goes with the flow of what God has been saying through people like Jonah and so on, is he sees the presence of God leaving Jerusalem and travelling the same route that the deportation took. The trouble is we don't know that because we just read we see them coming via the way of the north and so on. We miss it. This is the route that those who were taken into exile were taken via, going up to the Fertile Crescent and then back down again. You see, so kind of a looping thing. So the key thing that he's seeing is God is coming to join those who are in exile. He more so than he is in Jerusalem. Let me put it that way. And of course, during Ezekiel's book, he's eventually going to see the presence of God leave the temple fully, which is something that actually Isaiah has prophesied with that phrase Ichabod. If you remember, the glory has departed, isn't it? Yeah. It's already there in Isaiah, and Ezekiel actually witnesses it in the spirit. He sees God leaving the temple, and then a few days after he's had the vision, he hears, or he picks up in the spirit, and then the news comes that the temple has been destroyed. You see. So Zedekiah is rebelling against Babylon. So the Babylonians come down and invade, and they totally destroy Jerusalem. So the temple is destroyed, and then there is a third wave of deportations that go on. So what started in Israel, kind of, and happened under the Assyrians, and now there are people from Israel who are now spread abroad. And there are people still living in old Israel, but they're now a bit mixed up and a bit pagan. Those living in Judea have gone through a similar thing. And at this point, basically all of the capable people have now been taken away forcibly. So that all that's left in Jerusalem are the less well-educated and the more broken and so on. And so a Jewish governor is put in place, a guy called Gedaliah. But the Jews left in Jerusalem, they're poor and uneducated. The priesthood and the temple go from bad to worse, and they, as is the way, and it's interesting to understand the kind of psychology of this. That in the ancient world, those who were kind of politically savvy would know not to do this, but the people who are left, just in their anger and about what's happened, they see Gedaliah just as the puppet, and people who are like that very often don't know how to control what's going on, so they end up murdering Gedaliah. And along with some Babylonians, which of course is something that actually Jeremiah has warned against them doing. But now they fear reprisals, so because they suddenly realise, we've really blown it now. We didn't like him, so we killed him. We thought that was a good idea. Now we suddenly realise it was a bad idea, so we best go to Egypt. And they force Jeremiah to go with them. And others, those that don't, get executed, and a few more get deported. So I put here, Jerusalem is now in a really sorry state. and we kind of start now to move on. So we'll probably have a break for a cup of tea. So just on that kind of little bit, we've done a really broad sweep, but hopefully telling it in a way we often don't get it. We don't hear it. We hear individual prophecies and whatever. We're kind of putting them together so you can see the kind of the political flow of what God is doing. Yeah. Oh yeah. No, it does. It's a very real kind of, when you look at the way the world goes, it's a very you can totally understand what's happening, and I find it's really helpful because it puts the prophecies into a context, and so you've got to understand. Therefore, the people listening to them are primarily hearing about their context, but they're picking up stuff that goes beyond context, and that is my own experience of the way that the prophetic often works. Is that sometimes you find it's kind of got a very natural layer to it, but with these little bits that somehow just push it beyond what you're looking for and what you're expecting. And that's actually the kind of the way in which particularly we find that with Isaiah and Jeremiah, these major prophets, but technically you can find it in the minor ones as well. But so let's take a break and have a cup of tea, and then we'll look at what happens now in the exile, and the way that things start to come together then.